welcome in everyone to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Tuesday, June 18th, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about Steve Sarkisian. He had a fascinating conversation with Joel Klatt over the weekend that revealed a lot of really interesting stuff about him, about the Texas program, and why his program is really working the way that it is right now up there in Austin. Then we'll get into another head coach's comments. Brent Key made some very aggressive comments towards Georgia, and I want to break down why that is everything that is right about college football and why I want to see even more of that in the future as we get into the next era of college football. Then we'll jump into a little segment breaking down the Elite 11 finals. They start today. They'll end on Thursday. Tons of big-time players out there. A couple of guys that I wish were on the way to Los Angeles right now that are not, but at the end of the day, still some really remarkable guys out there this week to watch. Then we'll get into a new segment called Stock Up, Stock Down. We'll go through all the conferences. We're starting with the SEC today. I'll give you two programs I feel good about going into the next, 5-10 years, and then two programs I don't necessarily feel as good about going into the next 5 or 10 years. So we'll do that throughout all the conferences, but today we'll check off the SEC, and then we'll finish it out with a Top 10 Tuesday. And today, I'm going to get myself into a little bit of trouble, I think. I'm going to rank the best atmospheres in college football. This is obviously a very contentious matter, but Josh Pate put out his list, and it kind of inspired me to give my own take on it. So I figured I might as well do that today. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all, we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the Tip and Donation link at the bottom of the screen, GSMCPodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's always good for the both of us. Again, that's GSMCPodcast.net. But let's jump right in, and let's talk about Steve Sarkisian here for a little bit. He had a very, very interesting conversation with Joel Klatt over the weekend. He's been kind of bouncing around to different programs and been doing some really interesting conversations. I know he had one with Sharon Moore where a lot of stuff came out about him and his relationship with Jim Harbaugh that we talked about last week. Well, he went over to Austin, Texas and talked with Steve Sarkisian, and there's a ton to talk about, obviously. Coming off the season they just came off, being at the school that he's at, there's always plenty to talk about around Texas. So they got into a number of things throughout this conversation, and I want to kind of break down some of the things, maybe sort of in the order of importance, I suppose, at least the way that I saw it. The last thing is really something I want to dig in on because I think it's the real reason that Steve Sarkisian's been so successful at Texas. But I think the biggest thing here is when they were talking and when they were going back and forth is these guys very obviously feel very comfortable with each other, and they've been friendly for quite some time, covering each other's games and things of that nature. And I think there was an ability for them to sit down and have just a very genuine conversation, which is what we all want, obviously, from these college football coaches who at times can be a little bit guarded, right? They're obviously trying to protect their program, protect their players, and keep everything within building. But this was a really cool conversation because it revealed a lot of different things. But what I want to start with is what Steve Sarkisian had to say about two guys that left the sport this offseason and had a ton to do with who he is as a coach right now, Pete Carroll and Nick Saban. They actually both retired on the same exact day, which had to be quite the day for Steve Sarkisian, but he talked about just how important they were to his development as a head coach, figuring out, who you were, who you wanted to be, and how you wanted to run a program. That's a huge battle for so many head coaches, and it's a big reason that, a lot of head coaches will go into their first stint and it won't work out, and then they'll find their second place and it'll be gangbusters. It'll work out incredibly well, which is kind of what happened with Steve Sarkisian. Obviously, he was the coach at Washington, then USC, and now Texas, but getting that, chance where it didn't necessarily go the way that he wanted it to, and then being able to rebuild himself, especially through Nick Saban, was just hugely helpful to him. And he detailed that, in very great detail. But also, he said Pete Carroll and Nick Saban are the two biggest impacts on his coaching career, and it's not even close. And I think everyone kind of understands that, those two guys are going to have an impact on pretty much anyone they're around, but especially someone that wants to be a big-time head coach and now is at one of the biggest programs in the entire country. he learned a lot from those two, and just how to run a program and how to do what you need to do. And I think one of the coolest things that he said during that, and it's something he said a number of times, I've seen throughout his press conferences, was he used to be, he used to be a thermometer. He used to walk into a situation and he would kind of match whatever the energy was, whatever the vibe was in that room. He tried to match that. Now he's a thermostat. He walks into the room and he, sets the pace for everyone. He sets the temperature for everyone. And if you want to follow it, you can. If you don't, then essentially you're not going to be a fit at Texas. So it's a very interesting kind of analogy there, but it's something that every head coach has to go through. They have to figure out, what is that temperature that I want to set and how can I set it and make it the standard for my program. So I thought that was a really interesting kind of analogy that he put together about running a program. And I think one of the other things that I found really interesting, and frankly the only thing that I'm worried about Sark in Texas as of right now, is something that kind of popped up this past offseason with Ryan Day, which is usually head coaches that are play callers do not win national titles. It's been kind of a trend over the last decade where if you're calling plays, it's usually not going to result in the national title. Now, some of that is a little bit circumstantial. Some of that is, just the way of the world. But Ryan Day gave up play calling duties to Chip Kelly because he felt that was the best thing for his program. And they asked, or Joe Klatt asked Sark about his plans to do that and maybe how long do you think it's sustainable to do this. He said he's more than comfortable doing both. He feels very confident in what he can do, and a big reason for that is he has people around him that he trusts to the nth degree. All of those guys in that building, whether it's his offensive coordinator, Kyle Flood, or his athletic director, Chris Del Conte, everyone's on the same page. Everyone knows the standard, and they all live by that, which helps a ton. And then real quickly, I want to jump into his comments on the month of December. He said it was the hardest month of the year for him. He had to game plan for a playoff game. He had to practice with his guys, had to deal with guys leaving the program, and keep up with the portal entries coming in. He had to also close a top recruiting class. All of that had to happen in about 31 days, and it's just insane. It's too much to ask of these coaches. You have to move that forward. He did say he was a proponent of moving the signing day forward to the Wednesday before the conference championship weekend. I'm all for that. Just get it out of the way. Make sure that the portal and the recruiting world don't overlap, at least as much as possible, and kind of keep everything at least segmented if you can. And also, he wanted to keep all the players that are in the playoff. If your team is in the playoff, you cannot enter the portal. And I think that's a good thing on both sides of it. It keeps a headache away from the head coaches that have to deal with some of the players leaving, but also the players deserve a shot to play in those games. And I think a lot of players, Malik Murphy on Texas last year, missed out on an opportunity to go to that game with his team because there were a lot of quarterbacks jumping in the portal, and if he didn't jump in, he might have just missed his shot altogether. And then finally, I want to kind of get into really the crux of this conversation that they had, which the culture at Texas. That was the big question, obviously, a couple of weeks ago when they broke out the Lambos. People had some questions about, what their culture was. I don't have nearly as many questions. There's definitely some things where you don't know how it's going to go over the next 2, 3, 5 years at Texas. You don't know how he's going to handle this jump to the SEC and being in the spotlight once again as one of the premier coaches in college football. You never really know how all of that's going to go, but I thought one of the really interesting things in all of this was something that he calls Culture Wednesdays, and it kind of ties into all of this, all of the different things that he does. But on Culture Wednesdays, it's all about taking care of yourself. So, doing physical work, whether that's massages, physical therapy, ice baths, whatever that looks like. But most importantly, they have a meeting to kind of just talk about whatever anyone's going through. And Steve Sarkisian always starts these meetings. They have kind of parameters around these meetings that they want to talk about, but they kind of just let the guys go. And Steve Sarkisian talked about this, which was very eye-opening to me because it wasn't something that I knew about him and something that was very interesting. Obviously, I knew the details, but I didn't know he did this specific thing. As many of you know, Steve Sarkisian in the past has dealt with addiction and still deals with addiction to this day because it's, a never-ending battle. But he ran into trouble as his first stint as a head coach at USC, was fired from USC, and found his way back into football at Bama, and that's another reason why Saban is just so important to this guy, because he gave him a shot when not a lot of people were willing to, and it's absolutely incredible. And ever since that shot, he has been on a rocket ship to success. I mean, he went to the Falcons for a couple of years. I think had top 10 offenses in the NFL both those years, although it didn't necessarily click quite as well as some Atlanta fans would have liked. Made his way back to Alabama, was just incredible as the offensive coordinator, and now is the head coach of one of the biggest brands and biggest programs in the entire country. And I think a big part of that is every single summer when, the new guys, everyone's in for the new team that you have, he tells his story. He tells all the nooks and crannies, all the bad stuff, all the good stuff, all of the, trials and tribulations, everything that he went through. And I think that's something that might be a little bit lost in college football, just a little bit. I think there are some coaches out there that are absolutely entirely open with their team and entirely honest with their team at all moments, but I do think it's not necessarily as prevalent as a lot of us would like. I think, especially in his scenario where a lot of that information is public, a lot of these kids know that coming in, being forthright with them, being honest with them about what you've gone through is really important, and it builds trust between you and that team, and then it builds, an ability for these kids to talk about what they're going through and some of the battles that they're facing, and then you just build a team. And I think that's the biggest thing about Sark's tenure was, since he's shown up there, every single player that has fully bought in has said glowing things about the way that he's going about business and the way that he cares about his athletes and everything in between. And then there's some people that, find new places to play, and that's all well and good. But I do think there's an ability to speak openly, especially if you are the leader of a lot of young men that likely are not too inclined to do that in the first place, is super important. And one of the biggest battles in college football for every single coach across the country is getting probably 300 some odd people to pull in the same direction. That's, coaching staff, that's players, that's supporting staff, recruiting staff. Everyone needs to be pulling in the same direction. And you'll find it's way easier to do that when everyone knows what everyone else is about. Everyone knows, what everyone's dealing with, what everyone's going through. Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. Just understanding the person next to you makes you more willing to go to battle for them, makes you more willing to do the things that some college football programs just absolutely have to do to be successful. So I think that's the biggest thing about Texas football under Steve Sarkisian that hasn't necessarily been there in the past. No disrespect to the past two coaches. They, I think, had, their own strengths and their own weaknesses. But I think Steve Sarkisian came into this and said, there's going to be some questions about me. There's going to be some coaches that recruit negatively about me. In fact, he talked about that as he got back into the coaching ranks. That was something he dealt with. And he had to be forthright. He had to be honest with the recruits. He had to be honest with his players. And it's built a culture at Texas that just seems really rock solid. Every guy, when they walk into those buildings, it feels like everyone is on the same page. Everyone's pulling in the same direction. And they do it because a guy up top is being as honest and as vulnerable with them as really anyone in their life. So it's a huge bonus to what Texas is already doing on the field, which is building one of the best rosters in the country and doing everything on the field correctly. But the thing about, building a remarkable program, the thing about building a program that's going to compete for national titles is a lot of the work is done off the field. I understand, you got to get game plans ready. You got to make sure that you're executing at a really high degree. But at the end of the day, if these guys aren't pulling in one direction, if they don't understand each other, if they don't have, empathy and compassion for each other, you're not going to be successful. That's just the way it is, because football is the ultimate team sport, and if you're not all pulling in the same direction, you're not going to be successful. And Steve Sarkisian has found a way to get them all to pull in the same direction because they know who he is and they know who their teammates are, and it really does shine a light on just what Texas is going into this new era and why I have very few doubts about what the future of Texas football is going to be, because if that guy is leading it and he's leading it that way, I have no questions. I'll be totally honest with you. But we'll take our first break here. We went a little bit long there. I apologize. But we'll take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Brent Key. He made some fairly aggressive comments about UGA that I absolutely loved, and I want to break down why I love them and why I want to see much more of it in college football going forward right after this, so stick with us.